Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm Erica Lukes, and this is Expanding Frontiers. I am happy to be here, and usually I'm here on Friday at 5 p.m., but today we're doing the show a little bit earlier to accommodate our guest and his busy schedule. I want to thank everyone that takes a moment to get in and like and subscribe to our website and to YouTube. And I also want to thank the people that help keep us on the air by contributing to the show. We appreciate that. Make sure you go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out all the great work that Jack Brewer and myself have been doing with regard to uncovering corruption, the misuse of taxpayer funding with relation to the Uinta Basin and Skinwalker Ranch, the Skinwalker Ranch crew, and also are digging into cryptocurrency. Crypto has a big part in the UFO world. For most of you who don't know, I wanted to share that with you. And today is going to be a very insightful interview and a very, very important interview for me and for all of you, because we're going to be addressing issues that are very important to not only our democracy, but to help keeping us sane and to help potentially building bridges and beginning to weed through disinformation and misinformation to make our planet a better place. So without further ado, I am pleased to have Dave Troy here, and I have been reading and watching and just soaking up everything, Dave, that you have been doing, because you've been out there for many, many years talking about, the dangers of data mining and talking about the way that that can be, used to influence groups of people in steady groups of people that eventually, because of the disinformation they're receiving, that community falls apart. And I've seen you on many, many TED Talks talking about this. And to me, it just really hits home, because we've seen, especially since 2016, a lot of horrific things that have taken place in our world.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and thank you again for having me here, Erica. I really appreciate the opportunity. But yeah, I've been studying, this kind of, data and how people interact with social networks for about 15 years, and really curious, when the phenomenon first started, to understand, how are people using these things? What are they, who are they communicating with? Why are they doing the things that they're doing? And that sort of led me straight headlong into the world of, election manipulation and disinformation and whatnot that really came to the fore, between 2014 and 2016.
And that must have been a wild ride. I know for me personally, it was getting a firsthand view of the far radical right and some of the militia movements. That was a very interesting experience for me. And I want to just take a minute and say hi to Simon and Mystico and J Bench. Thanks for joining in. And then I also want to give a little bit more background on you, because you have, not only have you done that, but you're also a journalist, and you've also you've had, I want to just read off some of the things that you've been involved with, but Paranoia on Parade. You did a podcast, Dave Troy Presents, Medium blog and newsletter. You do public speaking, as I mentioned, TEDx, Beyond, is it LOT?
Oh, Internet of Things. I was
Okay.
keynoted that a couple times.
And you're curator of TEDx Mid-Atlantic in
Yep.
Washington, D.C. How fun.
Yeah, my background is really as kind of a tech entrepreneur. When I went to school, I kind of studied two things: computer science and history. And so, most of my career has really been focused on building products and, technology companies and stuff. And so I built and sold a couple companies over the course of many years. And then as all of this started to unfold, and, I became kind of curious about merging my interests in like data and history and stuff like that. So that really got me into the practice of using data to understand society. And then to properly understand society, you really need to dig into a lot of history in order to figure out where stuff came from. So what's been a lot of fun about my work over the last 3 or 4 years in particular is that I've been able to merge a lot of my technical skills with humanities skills and stuff I learned kind of from my liberal arts background, and put together interesting narratives, and I think really perform the task of sense making, because that's what's so hard, I think, for a lot of people right at this moment, is what even is going on. I mean, you've got Putin doing crazy things, and you've got Trump, and you've got Elon Musk, and cryptocurrencies and money, and oil and energy is shifting. I mean, so there's all of these tectonic plates that are shifting from underneath of us, and it can be very disorienting. And so what I found is that by using these skills to really make sense of the world for myself, I can then share that process with other people and hopefully contribute to a broader understanding that's a little bit deeper than just like Donald Trump did X today, which is a lot of what current discourse is. You need to be looking into the deeper picture to understand how we got here and where we might be going next.
Right. And that's so important, because I know I talk with a lot of people, and they assume that people should be smart enough to know that if you're hearing this information, you should fact check. And
Right.
it's like, but it's not quite that simple, because we've seen, what Cambridge Analytica did, and we've
Right.
seen, how we've had, all of our personal information taken away without our knowledge, and having that sold to the highest bidder to
Yep.
manipulate whole groups of people. And it's been so insidious and so subtle that you can have July 2016 take place, and then the whole world breaks open, and it's been outstanding. And more
Yeah,
outstanding, but it's been I mean, it's just
it's
been.
been extraordinary to live through
Yeah,
all this. I mean,
yeah.
it's a real shift from what people kind of expect the world to have looked like and how they thought it worked. The world is actually working a kind of a different way now, and I think that beyond just kind of the idea of like fact checking and like truth and are newspaper articles correct, the thing that people really have to get into their heads, it's a total shift in mindset, is the flows of information and the effects that language has on people as an instrument. So it's really about what information does to people, how it makes them feel, what it does to their social relationships, whether it causes them to become more cultish or paranoid, and we're still evaluating it in terms of like, is the claim true? Well, you can ask any kind of seventh grade gossip whether a true fact can disrupt a social network. I saw Joey kissing Jamie's girlfriend. I mean, that kind of stuff can have a real effect on how people perceive the world. And so this is really about how you weaponize information and how you use it to control social structures that form in society, and how you can reform new social structures and create competing realities that are at war with each other. I mean, it's just full on societal manipulation. And you can argue that, yeah, I mean, this kind of stuff has been going on through the form of propaganda and the CIA and Mockingbird and whatever people want to claim on that for decades. And yes, that's true, but it's reaching a level of sophistication and speed that has just been unprecedented. We've never been able to shape and mold society so quickly, and without really even understanding what's happening to us before. So it's just a totally new world.
It is. And I mean, do you ever feel like it's just gone so completely out of control that we're never going to be able to put the genie back in the box?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about that daily, and particularly with just the rapidity with which we are introducing new things into the ecosystem. Artificial intelligence kind of came onto the scene like a Mack truck over the last 6 to 12 months, but particularly in the last month, and particularly in the last couple of weeks, it's gotten to the point where people are like, wow, this is changing really fast. And the danger there is, I'm not so worried about the AI. Like, it's like being worried about toaster ovens or crowbars or blenders or something. Like, these are useful tools, right? But what I'm worried about is the kind of almost religious zeal with which people are adopting some of these things, and the idea that they're making decisions about the future based on their guesses about where this is going and what it means. And a lot of people that are pushing those kinds of lines about what AI means and where it's going are motivated to gain power themselves. So somebody that's in the business of selling AI is going to have a motivation to say, oh man, AI is going to totally transform everything, we need to reshape our entire society around AI because it's going to be amazing. Well, they're kind of motivated to sell that story because they're going to benefit a lot
Right.
from being in the position to profit from all that. So I think that we need to be, slow down a little bit, pump the brakes, not just on, I mean, I don't know that we can pump the brakes on the AI. There was that whole letter that came out last week
Mhm.
or early this week. I can't even keep track of time anymore about, whether we should pause AI development for 6 months or something. I kind of don't think that that's realistic just because, there's just so much going on around the world and there's a lot of open source stuff and the cat's kind of out of the bag. But I do think that we can take a more critical point of view in terms of how we evaluate this stuff. There was an article, an op-ed in Time magazine, from one of the guys who kind of invented the idea of like artificial general or general artificial intelligence. And he was saying that we need to stop now because we're going to destroy all humanity. Everybody's going to die basically. And well, it's a point of view. I don't know that I can evaluate that opinion or not. It seems a little bit extreme to me. But I guess the fact that we're so quickly kind of devolving into these very extreme sets of opinions about what this means, and that you have to kind of take it as a matter of faith, it feels like religious dispensationalism to me, like the idea that we don't have to do anything because Jesus is coming soon, so
Right.
whatever. So to me it just maps onto that same brain space and it feels
Mhm.
very uncomfortable as a result.
Wow. No, that's absolutely true. That'll be, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what takes place with all of this coming up. But I want to kind of go back to the beginning because I love the way you explain, some of the precursors to QAnon and some of these cults that we see present day that are having a very detrimental effect on our democracy. But going back to the I am movement
Yeah.
and talking about that, if you could just share a little bit about your research into that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that I will admit I knew nothing about until about 3 years ago. And what we found in researching some of the things connected to QAnon and to libertarianism, which kind of sits underneath some of the QAnon stuff, is that there was a cult group that got started in 1933 or so called the I Am movement. And it was started by a couple named Guy and Edna Ballard. And basically, they started it in Chicago. And Guy Ballard was a failed wallpaper hanger who kind of was looking for ways to make money. And so he had gone on a trip to Mount Shasta in California looking in part for gold. These guys, for whatever reasons, these folks are all obsessed with gold. And so he was, sort of trying to find gold, and he claims to have run into Saint Germain, who, for those of you that don't know Saint Germain, as I did not know Saint Germain until 3 years ago, turns up everywhere in kind of the UFO cult phenomenon space, partly because of the I Am cult. But at any rate, he was alleged to be a kind of a quasi-historical figure who traveled throughout Europe and was extremely talented at music and politics and history and art and just a Renaissance man. And he also was very wealthy and had access to a lot of gold and jewels and stuff like that. So basically, Saint Germain appeared to Guy Ballard, he said, and Guy Ballard kind of took this apparition back home with him and said, hey, this is super cool. Saint Germain has appeared to me and revealed to me the I Am teachings. Now, of course, I am being a phrase from the Bible, like I am that I am. But the way that the Ballards really spun it, it was really much more connecting into the tradition of theosophy. So Guy's wife, Edna Ballard, worked in a kind of a theosophical bookshop in Chicago, and so she was quite well read in Blavatsky,
Mhm.
Helena Blavatsky theosophy. And so she started to basically write up the revelations or the teachings of Saint Germain as revealed to Guy Ballard. And most people think, at least that I've read on this, think that probably it was Edna that wrote the texts that were attributed to Guy Ballard. Guy also went by the name Godfrey Ray King. And they had a bunch of whimsical kind of weird things that were variants from the Blavatsky Theosophy. They also borrowed heavily from William Dudley Pelley's Silver Shirts movement. So they had both been, aware of that, and some people that were connected to the I Am cult had been involved in it. They recruited people from Pelley's movement because it underwent some kind of atrophy. I forget exactly the reason why at that time, but basically that was a fascist movement that was kind of born in the model of Mussolini and like Hitler's brown shirts and that kind of thing. And so he had these legions of people all across the United States that were called Silver Shirts, and they would wear special shirts with a little L on it, L being for liberty. And Pelley's story was very similar to Ballard's in that he claimed that he had been alone in his cabin, and like over the course of, I think it was like 7 minutes or something, he had a visitation. I don't remember whether it was from Saint Germain or another ascended masters being sort of the characters in Theosophy. And they were mostly kind of made up folks that Blavatsky thought were cool. There was Moria and all these, I don't know, I can't remember them all. Kutumi is one of them. But you can lose a lot of time reading about Theosophy and how it kind of bled into the Silver Shirts and then into I Am. But the interesting thing about I Am from a political perspective was that they were super down on the New Deal. They really, really hated Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt in particular. They thought they were satanic. So basically, they would do chants against Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, saying "blast, blast, blast their carcasses, off the earth forever." It was like super highly partisan content, you might say. And it actually is reminiscent in some ways of kind of like what later would become with like the hatred of like Hillary and Bill Clinton. It was a kind of a precursor to that. So basically the deal was that they were super into gold. Roosevelt had outlawed gold in 1933 when he came into office because he basically needed money to pay for the New Deal, and he didn't want to dilute the Treasury's holdings of gold. And so, he wanted to sort of hoard all that for the government's use so that they could basically, what they say now, printing money to pay for the New Deal programs, which, kind of needed to be done. And most Americans agreed with that policy. But the I Am cult basically ended up forming this like de facto anti-Roosevelt political cult that was rooted in like, love of gold. And what's funny about it is that there were other organizations, like there was a group called the American Liberty League that formed in the 1930s as kind of like a formal political, organization that was opposing the Roosevelt and the New Deal. And they really didn't get much traction. It was funded by like the big manufacturers and stuff like that, but they just couldn't get people to really buy into it because it just wasn't that popular. People really liked the New Deal and what it was doing for the country. So what they kind of found was that this I Am group, which they claimed at one point had like 1 million members, was actually much better at activating and gathering up people that shared this kind of anti-Roosevelt sentiment, but it wasn't explicitly like a political stance. It was much more, it was literally a cult.
Mm-hmm.
And they would do stuff like say, when you go to the I Am gatherings, which were often like traveling roadshow type things, where Guy and Edna Ballard and their son Donald would show up in a city, and people would come and they would bring what they called love gifts, which were basically just monetary contributions to the Ballards. And so they made a ridiculous amount of money on this. And to the point where, they ended up with so much money that they got indicted on mail fraud charges.
Wow.
In like 1940. And Guy Ballard died around that time. And so the whole thing kind of spun into a kind of a disarray. But then that morphed into something like 20 years later called the Church Universal and Triumphant, which is was headed by Elizabeth Clare Prophet. That also is known as Summit Lighthouse, and they based that in Gardner, Montana, which is right outside Yellowstone National Park. And they bought a big ranch there, and they bought that ranch from Malcolm Forbes, it turns out.
Wow,
And
that
it
was an
turns out
interesting
that
connection.
yeah, and it turns out that one of Charles Koch's main mentors, a guy named Robert Lefebvre, who was a big libertarian guy. He started a thing called the Freedom School. He was an IM guy. So the IM movement
Wow.
had an incredible impact on the libertarian movement, and the whole love of gold and the hatred of the Federal Reserve. I mean, this all loops back to like the protocols of the Elders of
Mhm.
Zion as sort of implemented out through cults. And so this was my introduction to that whole space, and I've had to kind of figure it out and map it, and I unfortunately understand it way too well at this point. Yeah, I'm happy to go on any related topic, but yeah, that's
Well,
basically what happened.
and I think that this is, I mean, it's so interesting because we all think that, that what we're living is like is a brand new thing. But if you look back to the 30s, it's like this is
Yeah,
just another version of what
yeah,
we've
it's
got
another
going on
iteration.
today. And yeah, of Trump and then his little Michael Flynn and
Yeah,
the road show that they're going on.
yeah,
That Michael
yeah.
Flynn is going on. But it's very interesting to see how ideas like this take hold and how people that are potentially grifting and trying to manipulate people, how that takes hold and spreads. And I want to just mention Ramtha for a minute and get
Oh
your
yeah, yeah.
thoughts on
Jay-Z Knight.
Ramtha. Yep.
Yeah, she's another derivative of the I am cult, and so this is a woman named Jay-Z Knight. Her thing is in Oregon, I believe.
I think it is, yes.
Yeah, and so she has what she calls the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, and it was pretty much based on the same set of stuff as like the I am cult. Possibly, I'm sure she has her own unique twists on it, but the idea being that there's these ascended masters that she can channel, and people can learn great things from being around them. And honestly, I mean, a lot of this is really geared around personal prosperity and like success and stuff like that. So a lot of the reasons why people get involved in this is so as to kind of like change their lives and try to become more successful and really manifest. People use that term casually now like it's a normal word, but that whole concept of like making something appear is really comes out of this theosophical tradition in part. The idea of the law of attraction and like attracts like and the secret and all of that, that's all sort of drawn from the theosophical teachings.
It's interesting because Ramtha was for quite some time a big money donor to MUFON,
Yeah,
which I
and
always
she
found
became a big Trump donor as well in 2016.
very interesting. I know that there are several videos of her that you can find out there where she's channeling, Ramtha, where and
Hmm.
there were some questions about what was taking place up in her compound and some allegations of, I believe, of sexual abuse and some pretty disturbing things that came out, but I have not heard anything as of late. Have you?
Not really, no. I get the feeling that maybe her thing is kind of fading into the background a little bit right now. But again, who knows with these things? I mean, they're pretty secretive organizations, and like you say, I mean, anytime you get these kinds of cultish, assemblies of power, there's usually abuse of power that goes along with it, and oftentimes that comes out in the form of sexual abuse or money or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I that was one of the kind of disturbing things that I really saw in the UFO culture. I mean, it was just that was so prevalent, not only the grift and the disinformation, misinformation, but really, just creating that, a person that turned into a robot. I mean,
Right.
thinking and feeling that they had these experiences and having a person basically just put things into their head. And I mean, it was really alarming for me to see some of the things that took place in the UFO world.
Yeah, I've been working a lot with Steve Hassan and Joe Simhart, who are both, cult survivors and now cult experts. And they've helped a lot of people, sort of get out of cults. But, it basically, you really have to kind of get into how social influence works, how undue influence works to understand any of this. And I had just enough information kind of from some of my previous work to have at least a little bit of idea how that might work. And then it was really talking with Steve and Joe and some of the other experts that they've put me in touch with that have helped me to understand that social influence is very real. It can lead to these, what I've come to call like social black holes, which are basically what cults are. Now, Steve would put the asterisk on that unlike a black hole, you can escape from a cult, but it requires a desire to do so, and a set of tools and skills that you kind of have to actually go pursue. And or I suppose it can blow up on its own, as they sometimes do. But point being that these are very pernicious social constructs, and they can kind of form on their own. They can get co-opted by people who want to use them for certain things. People can be used for things sometimes without them even really realizing that they're being used. And so it's a really murky area of kind of human behavior, and unfortunately it's just playing a bigger and bigger role in geopolitics.
Absolutely. I mean, it really is. I know, for me, again, over the years, as I've said, as I've interacted with different people in the UFO or the paranormal community, I've been quite amazed to, because at first I was thinking a lot of these people were very evolved. I mean, they were very
Right.
spiritual people, and had a concern for other human beings or the environment or things like that. And I definitely learned, as I start looking through, I've got, 2,000 books on the subject here, and I've got history and magazines that date back to the 40s and newsletters, and just to go back and read, and then to read things that are very much, I mean, what else can you say? There was a Nazi agenda from day one. I mean, it was just
Yeah.
like, you can look at these pictures that have been drawn in these magazines, and you have a crowd full of people all dressed in their suits, and somebody's, at the top going, I mean, it was just like, oh my Lord. And it's throughout it. And so
Yeah.
there have been some very shady things going on. And, the UFO is a nice way to catch people in and to bring them into that. But then things happen.
Yeah, no, once you're kind of in that social milieu and people have got their hooks into you and they're starting to, you know, sort of get you to do things or participate in small groups or big groups, you start to become your will starts to be compromised. Your agency starts to become compromised. And one of the I again, talking with Steve and Joe and some of these other experts, one of the key things that I think differentiates, say, like a constructive social organization. You could even say that there's such things as constructive cults if you want to go that far. But the thing that differentiates destructive from constructive groups is the idea that if you try to leave, somebody's going to try to stop you or get in your way or cause you problems. And if that's the case, then get out, because that's a number one sign of a really dangerous situation. Obviously, there's other things like are people abusing you sexually or trying to take advantage of your money or whatever else. But in terms of just like an early indicator of things that could be a problem, if you think you would have trouble getting out, get out, because they're trying to suck you in and make sure that you have a hard time getting out, and that's obviously bad. So
It is. And what do you think, like with that in regard to like some of the alien abductees, that you've seen, especially back in the 80s and 90s. But I mean, for me, I see a huge problem with that, and the people that
yeah.
were involved in that, because they, first of all, I don't believe really knew what they were doing, and they shouldn't have been giving people advice that could potentially be damaging to their mental state. And I mean, that was talk about a cult-like experience there that had real detrimental effects on people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on sort of the alien abductee phenomenon, but and I will say that I come at all of this set of topics very much from the standpoint of like history and geopolitical research. It's probably not something I would be even really studying were it not directly applicable to current geopolitics and whatnot. But to the extent that a lot of people get pulled into these kinds of movements, the thing that I find consistent is that people are looking for community. And, if they can kind of convince themselves that they've been through some kind of an experience, or maybe they really believe it, for whatever reasons, then, they are going to be much more likely to, be on a pathway to find community and to, be around others who believe similar things for whatever reasons. And, that sort of naturally occurring infolded group influence, where the group starts to influence itself, that can be extremely difficult to kind of extricate yourself from. And, the other thing that I found in researching how kind of cult recruitment happens online, which is really also how disinformation targeting happens online, is that a lot of it is directed to people who have what social psychologists call high self uncertainty. So the idea that people are going through trauma, or they're not sure what's the future holds, or maybe they've had some unsettling events, or they're otherwise kind of not totally anchored, they become good targets for kind of re-anchoring them into something else. And so, for example, people have targeted like depression message boards and addiction message boards for recruitment. And even more kind of nefarious than that, there's a company called Glue out of Colorado that has done stuff like take mental health data and use it to recruit people into far right leaning churches, stuff like that. And there's a documentary that covers this called People You May Know, by Charles Creel, and Kat Gelline, his partner. And it's completely real. That's how this stuff works, is people are looking for ways to pull people into the orbit. And it's not to say that like a right-leaning church is like bad necessarily. It's just when you're targeting people based on their personal trauma, and you're using, and the claim made in that film is that they're using de-anonymized mental health data from like apps and stuff that they've gotten access to, and like figured out how to target people, with like micro targeting, to basically say you should come to this church on Sunday because I think you might be going through a hard time right now based on your addiction and your, uh, recent divorce. It's pretty nefarious, because they know that once they get people into these churches, their chance of voting and voting, like a certain way goes way up. So, that's the brave new world we are living in when it comes to social influence right now.
And I mean, and it's so far-reaching. I mean, I think what we saw with the whole QAnon thing, I mean, the people in the New Age community, people that were, I mean, health and wellness instructors, people in, had dojos. I mean, it was all over the board. If you had an
Yeah.
interest, like you say, there would be a person or a group of people there to mind you, handle you, and then, eventually begin to really lay on the manipulation. And it
Yeah,
was
and
something
I
else.
mean, what's really fascinating about that is I've been digging quite a bit into the history of how that all kind of came to be. The sort of overlap between the libertarian movement and right-leaning stuff, and say the New Age movement. And so last month in February, I attended the Conscious Life Expo in Los Angeles, which is a hotbed of very interesting stuff. A lot of theosophy related stuff. People, realigning their chakras, and meditating and getting in touch with Saint Germain, and ascending and going from the 3-dimensional world to the 5-dimensional world, and the Mayans and 2012 and all of that. And, I've been studying all that for a few years now to try to understand why it has such a hold on people. And basically, what you see happening in that like alternative health movement is that there was kind of a merger between kind of right-leaning groups from the 1950s with various new age communities that emerged in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So here's an example of how that happened. So there was a group called the National Health Federation, which got formed in the mid 50s, like around 1955. And so this was the same time when the John Birch Society was kind of getting ramped up, which again was pretty much the same people as like the IM and the Liberty League people, that, the anti-Roosevelt people. So the National Health Federation was basically centered on the idea of health freedom, and the idea that people should be free to treat themselves however they want, and they shouldn't be subject to stuff like water fluoridation. And they wanted also, by the time the 60s and 70s came around, they were very into vitamin B17, also known as Laetrile, which was an alternative, and still is an alternative cancer treatment that people believe, can cure cancer or treat it or something. And the reason they think that is because it's extracted from apricot and peach pits and contains cyanide. And so they think that the cyanide targets the cancer differentially. There's no evidence to suggest this is true.
Okay.
So basically, from the 50s up through even the 80s, but especially in the late 70s, the National Health Federation was championing, anti-water fluoridation, anti-vaccination, and, pro-Laetrile. And so that network of people had like annual health expos to showcase alternative health and stuff like that. And they did some stuff that wasn't bad. Like they introduced the idea that vitamins should be regulated as a food and not as a drug. So that's the reason why you can like buy vitamins at the grocery store now. And that stuff all seems kind of common sense now. Likewise, they were starting to get into other kinds of, alternative health and, meditation and mindfulness and all these kinds of things that people now kind of take for granted as being just part of society. So it's not like they're evil or all bad, but it led to this kind of nucleus of people that were questioning a lot of stuff about health. And some of that questioning was kind of toxic. And so that network of people basically went on to form their own network of trade shows and stuff in the 70s and 80s. So what had been the National Health Federation shows turned into what was called then the Whole Life Expo, which was partnered with Whole Life Times magazine. And I just recently interviewed like all the people that were involved in the creation of all this stuff. And they were very nice and gave me a lot of info, but it took that level of digging to understand what was going on. So basically what happened is over the course of the 80s into the 90s, the Whole Life Expo, let's just say that it got a little bit edgier in terms of the amount of kind of maybe questionable stuff that kind of got into the mix. And it also became a recruitment ground for the Oprah Winfrey Show. So the Winfrey Show was sending producers to the Whole Life Expo in the 90s to say, hey, what's hot, what's cool, what's on the edge that, we can help popularize. Because they had this TV show beast to feed, where they've got to, do a daily show, and they've got this audience of certain age women mostly, and they're really trying to get stuff that will resonate with that audience. So there ended up being this kind of synergistic feedback loop between like say the Oprah crowd and the Whole Life Expo. And it got to the point where some of it was maybe a little bit over the edge, and I guess until the last few years, I think you could say that the stuff that was over the edge was maybe just a little silly, or maybe a little bit, I don't know, not credible. But this year at the Conscious Life Expo, they featured a track called The Rabbit Hole Room, featuring a whole bunch of QAnon influencer types, including, like Sean Stone, Sasha Stone, who are not related, but, and so I went to that to see what they were saying and how this all worked. And let me tell you, it was, over the top. And so there's kind of just been this natural synergy that's formed between this anti-vax. Oh, and they also had a premiere of Mickey Willis's new Plandemic 3 film, which is, a big health freedom, anti-vax, anti-lockdown, all of that kind of stuff. And, like whatever, but that's how this like new age anti-vax health freedom pipeline developed over the course of like 70 years. And it's just wild when you think about that it has that history, but it really does. And so I'm working on some podcasts and writing that'll tell that story. Because I think the popular narrative right now is that QAnon bled into the New Age community, and I'm going to argue it because it went the other direction. It was really more an amplification of this set of networks that already existed.
How fascinating. And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, I had heard in I think one of the shows that you had done, and I didn't know this, that Oliver Stone's bodyguards were oath keepers.
I don't know that I remember that, but that sounds believable to me.
Yeah, that was just amazing to me. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap with Oliver Stone and like the libertarian stuff. And of course, he's become a very pro Putin person as well. I don't really know what's the deal with him. And his son, Sean, who's a very smart guy, went to Princeton. Sean is a huge Putin propagandist at this point. I heard him give a 20-minute long answer to somebody about why Putin was so great and Alexander Dugin is awesome. And, like it was a lot. And so anyway, yeah, I mean, that network is all kind of fused together as one now. And, we can get into the reasons why, but yeah, it's been fascinating to observe all that.
that is really fascinating. It's been fascinating too, in the UFO world over the years to see different people, specifically, I believe, people like George Knapp, Jacques Vallée, the biggies in the field who have, had to say reference Russia frequently and have been over to Russia at
Hmm.
certain points in time. And in fact, about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was a conference where they took investigators from different continents, and they brought them over to Russia
Mm.
to have it was a meeting that was organized by Russian government and the Chinese government. And,
Oh,
and
wow.
so, it was just like,
Email me more about that. I want to know about
yeah,
that
yeah, no,
if I
it
don't
was
already.
very, very interesting because nobody really said a lot about it that went, which
Yeah,
I found fascinating. But I
interesting.
definitely, raised a red alarm bell for me. And so I've
Yeah,
been looking in that because looking into that. And then you also have, the fact that you've got George Knapp and Coast to Coast AM radio
yeah,
and
which is Clear Channel.
yep. And then, I mean, and they're promoting, Larry Flynn and I mean, Michael Flynn, excuse me. And then,
Mm.
the Stuart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers and
Yep.
Alex Jones and all of these people. And it's just
Hmm.
like, wow. I mean, what are we really doing here? And it's for me, it's obvious they're using people that have a desire to question,
Hmm.
reality, to question, is our government doing what we need them to do? And then they
Right.
go down that rabbit hole, and then pretty soon the FEMA camps are coming, and
Yeah.
you're bunkering down somewhere. But
Well, I
it's just
mean, those
fascinating.
narratives go back a long time. I mean, William Dudley Pelley, after he went to jail for a while, uh, he in like the 1950s started like a UFO magazine, actually, and started raising a lot of questions with people about UFOs and contact. I think my personal opinion, and folks that are listening that maybe have different opinions or know more about this are welcome to disagree with me, but I think that in a lot of ways, the UFO and the contactee and the, all the, possibility of actually connecting with outer space visitors is a kind of a reformulation of the ascended masters theosophy concept. Like the idea that, prior to World War II, the idea was that there were these ascended masters who resided in the heavens and they would appear at appropriate times and help those of us on earth trying to struggle with things to get through our daily trials and whatever. It's not unlike Catholic saints or something like that. But I think that what happened after World War II and perhaps with the invention of the nuclear bomb was that there was some sense that we could now manifest or make real these visitors, and that we could actually be in real contact with them. And I don't know whether it's the invention of rocket technology or the bomb or just a cultural evolution that just happened, but people became more and more kind of convinced that, like, there were other kinds of creatures out there. And I suppose the ability to contemplate actually going to the moon and doing that, I mean, that helped to I think cement the idea that traveled, outside of our solar system and certainly outside of the Earth was possible. So, that had been brewing a long time. But in terms of like this, the psychology of it, I really feel like it resembles theosophy quite a bit. And I just wonder if that isn't kind of psychologically what's going on there, where we've kind of mapped that visitor narrative onto the space age by way of kind of inventing flying saucers and all of that. I would also say that all of that aside, the number one function that it seems to me that the UFO narratives provide is they get people questioning their government. They get people asking the question, is the government hiding something from us? And if so, what? And if so, why? And that's such a powerful thing. If you have a motivation to get people to take control of the government or to overthrow the government or to dramatically change the government, you need to implant those kinds of narratives and to help grow them. And whether or not that narrative came about sort of as a result of like right-wing CIA people, maybe, I mean, there's some evidence to suggest that might be true, but whether that was the origin or not, it functions that way. And it's very clear to me now, especially having gone to, things like Conscious Life Expo and whatnot, that there's a huge anti-government strain that runs throughout something like that. And so I mean, it was just shocking to me. And I have recordings of some of it that I'll try to get into a podcast episode, but people questioning the Federal Reserve and people questioning the different branches of government and government secrecy and all this. It was just pervasive, all the anti-government rhetoric. And look, I mean, is the government perfect? No. We have been reliant way too much on secrecy. Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a whole book about that in like 1998. We need to be a much more I think responsive government in terms of sharing the information that we have and whatnot. But I really think that I just don't think it's a coincidence that all of this government stuff is coinciding with a resurgence in UFO interest at the same time. I just don't think that's coincidental.
And so where do you think that is coming from then, if you had a guess?
I mean, I'm not going to say that it's like some kind of purposeful campaign being waged by somebody in particular. Although, there are people that would benefit from driving that kind of a narrative. The Putin government would benefit from driving that kind of a narrative. Various elements, sort of the people that were driving January 6th would benefit from that. The Chinese might benefit from that, or, different Chinese factions, depending on who's really in charge in China right now. So, I think that there's reasons why people like that would amplify stuff like that. And I think you could consider it as being like naturally occurring, but you could give it a boost. And, you could do stuff like organize conferences that are international and bring everybody together and talk about UFOs. I mean, so there's little things you can do like that help push those things to the forefront. And I'm amused. I'm sitting here in an old house in Maryland, and we have a lot of old books and stuff around from my wife's family and stuff. And one of the books, actually, I think I have it right here. Yeah, I do. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects.
Oh, yes.
And this is an interesting artifact. It's, sort of covering the Blue Book stuff. But this book came out in, I think, about 1956 or so. Yeah, 56. And interestingly, it was a Book of the Month Club selection. And so this I think was probably sent to my wife's grandmother in 1956.
Wow.
And, it raises the question. I'm like, well, why did the Book of the Month Club select this book, to be their featured thing? And it's talking about hoaxes, hallucinations, or spaceships, and like, this just sounds like the current discourse, So I think it's interesting to consider that from the standpoint of like, cultural artifacts that and naturally occurring movements in culture that can be amplified and sort of modulated to produce different kinds of effects at different times. And this, that was in 56, that's right when the John Birch Society was founded. It was the height of anti-communist paranoia. I just don't think that that's coincidental.
No, I don't think so either. That's really fascinating. Um, yeah, I love that. I love that. That book has got to be worth something. I think I've got
Something,
that
yeah.
back here. Something. I've got so many of those books I need to dust off and read again. But it is, yeah, that is, the whole thing is fascinating to me. And so, I mean, where do you think with the QAnon stuff? Where do you think that this is going to continue to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of multiple things that are going to probably happen at the same time. I think, there's still a tremendous appetite for in-group belonging and people to feel like they're part of something. And so I think that we're going to see continued movements where people, are sort of joining into these social fabrics that make them feel like that they're fighting something and that they're, on the side of good, and that there's an evil enemy that they're countering. So I think, that's kind of inevitable. I think that's just kind of how things work at these days in particular, and that'll just continue on. That being said, I also think that we're getting much better at kind of decoding and just deconstructing how this all functions. And, people like me, and others, who are researching into this and can explain in some level of detail, like, okay, well, this is kind of how we think this functions, and this is why we think it works this way. This is what we think the motivations are. This is tied into this historical strain of thought that, goes back 100 years. And, perhaps it would be good if, people got out of it. And so that influences stuff like, op-eds. It influences the tone of cultural conversation, so that sense making kind of happens more readily at scale. And so, it's kind of, Bucky Fuller, who I've also studied in all of this, strangely enough. He had this line, call me trim tab, which is the little tiny piece on the airplane that allows the plane to, maintain a constant direction. And, you just the slightest little change with that, you can steer the plane, and, or on a ship, the same type of thing, and, cause a big shift in direction just with this one little piece. So I feel like, a lot of the people doing, research and writing in this space can be that kind of a trim tab and create an outsized effect on the culture. And that's what I've been trying to do, basically. But there's a lot of people that are trying to push things in the other direction and make us more cultish and more crazy. And certainly people, like Donald Trump, are taking full advantage of, every opportunity to sort of create as much chaos as possible. And I think Putin kind of is in the same vein, try to destabilize stuff as much as possible. So I think it's going to be a really dangerous next few months, even, but then beyond that, the next few years. I mean, 2024, Twitter, not that Twitter is like that important, but it does have an impact on the cultural conversation and the
Mhm.
tone of things. And that's going to be totally turned upside down by 2024. The White House just this afternoon said they're not going to pay for a blue check mark. And on the one hand, good for the White House. They shouldn't pay for a blue check
Right.
mark because it's crazy. But on the other hand, this means that the White House's messaging probably will be demoted in the feeds and may not reach as many people at a time when maybe the White House needs to be reaching people. So
Interesting.
it's we're
Wow.
brave new world. Yeah,
Yeah, it is Brave New World. It's just um, amazing. And I want to go back to, because I had heard you and Steve Hassan talking about social influencers
hmm
and how, what type of effect that has. And I think that a lot of people don't even understand that it's really taking place. What are the things that we can look for when we're looking, when we're on social media, when we're interacting with groups of people?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different ways we could take this conversation, but I would say that in general, should probably be on the lookout for folks that are seeking to generate emotional reactions and responses from people. There's really easy ways to like build audiences quickly online. One of the ways is to kind of constantly be posting and making it fairly emotionally reactive, and you will end up building an audience that just responds to that, because those people will follow you and then they'll share it, and then people that are just like them will also follow you and follow them and share your stuff and follow you. So there's an incentive built into that feedback loop for people to sort of build audiences that way. You see sometimes people go from, you know, 10,000 followers to like 400,000 followers
Right.
over the course of a couple of years. And, just by kind of following that formula, and it can be very effective. The other thing that I would say, to be mindful of is the idea of, getting into situations where you're blocking people a whole lot, or uh, cutting real world social ties with people. Um, that's a signal that you're being kind of shuttled into a particular social milieu. And I'm not saying don't ever block anybody, because sometimes you just have to, and there's people that are specifically, intent on causing you problems and whatever, and you certainly shouldn't have to put up with anything that's harmful or threatening. But when it becomes a matter of becoming totally isolated into some particular social milieu, that pay attention to that signal. And likewise with, cutting off real world relationships with family members or friends or something like that. It's not to say, again, that, you need to maintain every relationship, but um, some of this political stuff is temporary. Some of it will probably pass, and you don't want to necessarily get into a situation where, society has broken itself up so much that everybody's in their own little disconnected cults. And so, just maintaining some semblance of social ties, whether online or in real life. You don't have to talk about the contentious thing. You don't have to win anybody over. What Steve recommends is, when you're connecting with, potentially people that, have taken on different political beliefs from you, talk about the good times, talk about the things that you share, talk about good memories, things you want to do together, plans, future. But, try to avoid the stuff that's like super contentious, because it's just going to harm things. And honestly, a lot of times when people kind of get out of destructive frames of influence, they'll kind of say, yeah, I appreciate you keeping a lifeline out to me, because now I realize that I was into something kind of wacky. And I see things differently now. And that can take a long time.
Right.
It's not like it's going to take just a year or something. But if you cut off that pathway so that they can never return to kind of a more normal network, you may lose them for good, and that's to nobody's benefit.
Right.
Certainly not to society's benefit.
That's very yeah, that's a wonderful comment there. Absolutely. And I just have to look at all of my notes that I've been writing because of all the stuff that you've done. You also were mentioning, and I heard the name Eric Prince, and Steve Bannon, and then the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, 3%ers, things like that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that group of people and what your thoughts were and what you believe they are trying to do.
Yeah, so the Oath Keepers are interesting, in that this was really kind of a almost a kind of a brown shirts kind of outfit that developed parallel to the Tea Party. And so Stuart Rhodes, was very involved in the kind of Tea Party network that really grew up around the Ron Paul movement. And for those that, haven't tracked the Ron Paul thing terribly closely, the biggest thing about Ron Paul, and he ran for president in 2008 and 2012, and he was also in Congress uh, many years before that. But basically, he's a gold standard guy. And again, we get back to the gold thing. This is all about bitching and moaning about the Federal Reserve. And basically, in that regard, it's pretty much Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the idea that there's an international banking conspiracy that's ruining everybody's lives. So Ron Paul, big advocate of the gold standard, very anti-Fed. His slogan is "End the Fed." It's pretty transparent. So this whole network of folks grew up around Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012. And I think the idea when he ran for president, those years kind of under the libertarian banner, was that they didn't really think he was probably going to win, although they might have liked it if he got more votes than he did. But what they ended up doing was building up this tremendous mailing list of folks that, could go on to really help to steer the Republican Party into a much more libertarian direction. And that's pretty much what we've been witnessing, is a hostile takeover of the Republican Party by libertarian wingnuts, Ron Paul folks. And so Ron Paul was working very closely with a guy named Gary North, who was a fundamentalist Christian guy. He developed a strategy for really ending the Federal Reserve and introducing a gold-backed monetary system. They were tight with Lyndon LaRouche, who had a similar set of ideas. Lyndon LaRouche was tight with a guy named Sergei Glaziev, who is now running this BRICS currency project. So basically, the crazy stuff that Ron Paul, Gary North, Lyndon LaRouche, and Sergei Glaziev dreamed up in like 2008 about how to end the Federal Reserve is now happening, because Sergei Glaziev is Putin's guy for setting up this new BRICS currency with Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia, etc. So, that's sort of how you have to understand somebody like Stuart Rhodes, who again was the Oath Keepers. He was very instrumental in, January 6th, and, has been charged in all of that. And, there's a lot of emails and whatnot, but pretty much that's an end the Fed movement. Now, on the Christian side, Gary North and Ron Paul both, but especially Gary North, formulated the desire to end the Fed in Christian terms as well. So basically, not only is it like, evil Jewish banking conspiracy, it is immoral. And that's therefore the United States was going to come up against a kind of a day of reckoning when the shit was going to hit the fan, and the bill was going to come due, and we were going to have to get rid of the Federal Reserve and do a gold-backed system. And this would all be part of God getting retribution and restoring his will over the United States of America, according to Gary North. And this happened more or less to coincide with the network of people in Russia who also believed that, the West was immoral and, allowing gay marriage and LGBT and trans rights and all this stuff. And so basically that all got conflated into like one unified movement of traditionalism, and the idea that, the religious movements, the Christian movements in the United States were aligned, at least notionally, with the Orthodox Church networks in Russia. And so they started doing stuff like passing, bills back and forth between the Congress, US Congress, and the Russian Duma around anti-gay stuff. So there's actually also like an anti-abortion bill that got passed in Russia. It's a straight up copy of like a US equivalent bill in some state. It was like drafted by Alec or something,
Wow.
and so it ends up in the Russian Duma. And so that's, just very broad strokes how this network kind of came together, and, why there's this alignment between not only the monetary, positions of Putin and Ron Paul, but also on the Christian front. And so, you talk about like Eric Prince. I mean, he's part of a little bit of a different network. Rather than being so much in the Ron Paul thing, he was more part of like the Council for National Policy Network.
Okay.
And his family, the DeVos family and whatnot, was very instrumental in that. And that network in turn also is tied in with like Rebecca Mercer and that crew. So they're all sort of broadly aligned, but you're talking about kind of multiple different factions of power networks that have kind of merged together to create the effects that we see.
Wow. And are they special?
Yeah, no,
Are we excited about
we're
them?
all really enjoying it. It's really great.
And that brings me to Peter Thiel.
Oh yeah.
Because he has his long cold fingers worming around the UFO world, and
Yeah.
would I believe he did sponsor a UFO conference a while back,
Yeah, I think it's called
and
Hereticon, or at least
I
that's one of them. I don't know if there's more
yeah,
than one.
and I know that, obviously he's friends with Eric Weinstein. I
Yeah,
mean,
Brett
just
Weinstein, yeah.
yeah. What do you make of Peter Thiel?
Well, he's a strange dude, for sure. I think, first is to it's necessary to kind of understand him as being, deeply influenced by like German philosophy. So he's got this kind of deeply fatalistic, kind of Christian worldview that, is a little bit apocalyptic. I'd have to go check my notes to see specifically what all philosophers he was influenced by, but I want to say like Wittgenstein,
Mhm.
and uh, he is another one of these types that hated the New Deal. So one of his favorite books, I found this out from a friend of his, was well, several different books. One called The Forgotten Man, which is basically an anti-New Deal book that talks about how the New Deal actually harmed certain people. That for certain types of businessmen or whatever, it was very negative, and they had a bad time. That book was written by a woman named Amity Shlaes, who was a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which is another one of these like anti-New Deal organizations that was birthed in the 1930s. So he's carrying this kind of like New Deal revanchism gripe with him, and so very pro gold. He bought $50 million worth of gold bars for Palantir because they were preparing for a presumed Black Swan event. Of course, isn't it coincidental that he went on to be involved in a Black Swan event like last month or this month even, So, a lot of interesting questions to be raised there. But basically, he's kind of the mind that not only is the Federal Reserve bad and the New Deal's bad and all of that, but that kind of conventional Western society and wokeism and all of those things are super evil, and they're all holding us back from evolving to be our best selves. So basically, the whole idea, I think, with the Hereticon thing was they are trying to cultivate a network of people who basically commit what he calls like thought crimes. The people that think stuff they're not supposed to think, and the idea being that if you get people who are contrarian together and they start networking and making stuff, there's probably a lot of interesting things that could come out of that. And the idea being, if you want to do innovation, having people that think differently and getting them to work together is probably smart. So, like, that thesis isn't wrong or bad necessarily, but he's also sort of applying that type of methodology towards the task of like tearing down institutions and blowing up the government without other people's consent, and blowing up banks occasionally, as happens. So, the Hereticon thing is interesting because it's kind of focused on a few different topic areas. One is, I think, UFOs. There's also like psychedelics, transhumanism stuff, various kinds of meditations and whatever else. But it's kind of, I don't know, kind of edgy content. And I think part of it too is like, particularly with stuff like psychedelics, um, they perceive that as probably like a new frontier for business as well, because
Mhm.
there's arguably a lot of money to be made if you
Right.
wanted to get into the psychedelics business, and if you could sell it as therapy and whatever, and there's probably a case to be made for that.
Yep.
So I think they look at this as being contrarian and being kind of like using that stuff as a way to do business development. And also, I mean, if you really want to like shape a country to be very different, you could do worse than give everybody a bunch of, psilocybin or something, and see what happens, like, and feed them, anti-New Deal messaging while they're high on psilocybin. It might lead somewhere, so
Right.
I think
Right.
that's maybe part of the strategy too. And I'll tell you a
Interesting.
funny story about, you mentioned the Weinsteins. There's a guy that I know who was kind of in the online video space, and they identified him as somebody who was talented. And so in around 2000, I don't know, maybe 12 or so, they tried to recruit him to come be part of their like team of like online, influencer video types. And they were like, yeah, the first thing you need to start doing if you're going to join our crew is you got to start microdosing LSD. And, I mean, okay, whatever. I mean, people have their reasons why they might want to do that. But the idea that this was like a prerequisite
Yeah.
for working on
Mm,
this with them, I think it speaks to motive. It speaks to kind of their intent and their method of operation, and the fact that they have a really big picture view of this, and that they really like. I think the biggest thing people might get wrong about thinking about somebody like Teal or even the rest of this movement is to underestimate the ambition that they actually had. I think that the ambition is nothing less than like a complete remake of the United States government, if not a complete destruction of the United States government and replacing it with something else. you know,
right.
and there's this guy Balaji Srinivasan who's well known in the venture capital and tech community, but he's a buddy of Teal's, and Balaji's been like going bananas the last few weeks talking about how the dollar is going to collapse and the end of the Fed is near, and Bitcoin's going to go to $1 million
Oh,
a coin
I
and all
bet.
this, and yeah, and so it's this kind of sovereign citizen, extreme libertarian exit mindset that is pervaded all of this, and that's I think at the heart of kind of Teal's worldview.
Well, he's a special spirit, special
Oh
person.
yes,
Definitely.
yeah,
He frightens me a little bit, or a great deal actually, but,
yeah.
wow.
Well,
And
and
so
I talked to a friend of his who, in around November of 2021 said, yeah, the thing that worries me about Peter is that he keeps losing people that previously would talk sense into him. He's losing touch with those people. So like I was saying about social ties, and you don't really want to cut yourself off entirely, um, that's not a good sign when it comes to somebody like him who has a lot of power and a lot of weird German ideas, and that could lead us to a strange place. And I don't know if you saw the story from, I guess, early this week or last week about him. His One of his romantic partners committed suicide, it seems, in
no.
Florida. Yeah, he's married to some guy. I mean, he's gay. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he married to some guy, and then he had a romantic partner on the side, who was also like a male model. I think his name is like Jeff Thomas or something like that. And yeah, he committed suicide in Florida, and he was kind of like living the life of like a kept man. Of he had a $300,000 car and a $13 million house and all of this, but he was not happy. It seems, assuming that he did commit suicide. I know people are speculating maybe he was killed or something possible. Who knows? But point being, I think he had plenty of motive to commit suicide too. Being Peter Thiel's kept dude in a gay relationship when the guy is trying to wage a culture war against gay people is sort of weird
Right,
flex.
right.
So there was indication, and there was an article I think in the Intercept by Ryan Grimm talking about how um, this guy Thomas had expressed dismay to Teal that like he was pursuing this like crazy culture war, and kind of wished he would stop, and apparently Peter wasn't stopping, and so that was a reason why he might have been in a state of despair. But yeah, he's sort of floating away from his social connections that it might have otherwise been tempering him.
Oh, that's frightening. That is
Yeah,
really
it's
frightening.
disturbing.
And I've got to ask you too, because I want to get into crypto for a
Yeah.
little bit. And you at one point in time were really, much more into that than you are now. But
Hmm.
give us your
Yeah,
give
yeah.
us your story about that.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a technology entrepreneur, and I've been in the tech space since I was 14 years old, 12 years old. So that's been a long time. Mid 80s, I've been in the tech scene, and so I've been monitoring new developments in the tech world forever. And when cryptocurrencies came along in like 2009, I was paying attention to it and monitoring it, and I was kind of wondering where it might go, and I was, curious as to, is there anything here, or is this just kind of a weird, side thing that isn't going to amount to anything? And so, I pretty much ignored it until about 2013 or 2012. I guess it was 2012, And I was like, all right, well, I guess I should learn something about this. I'm in tech. I'm like a tech influencer. I should understand this. So I bought like $50 worth of Bitcoin, which at the time was, I think, a tenth of a Bitcoin or something. And I said, oh, well, okay, that's exciting. Is that it? Is that all there is to it? I just sit here and with my $50 worth of Bitcoin. And so I kind of ignored it. And then my son started, he was a teenager at the time, and he started messing around with Dogecoin, because he was like active on Reddit a lot and stuff, and people were talking about it there. And I figured, oh, this is interesting. It's solving prime number problems. Perhaps he'd be, learn something from this. So he was mining Dogecoin on one of his computers, and I was like, well, I have access to like a rack of computers that aren't doing that much. I could put the program on there and we could mine, and we'll see how much we get. That's pretty exciting. So and this was like 2013. And we racked up something like 30,000 Dogecoins over the course of a few months. And I was like, again, all right, well, is that it? What is that worth? Oh, it's worth like 4 cents. Okay, awesome. That's great. So then we pretty much forgot about it and ignored it for several years. And of course then Bitcoin and Dogecoin both appreciated quite a bit in value. And so we were like, oh, well, that's interesting. Now we've got, $2,000 worth of Dogecoin. That's pretty exciting. And again, we were like, well, and then what? We didn't really do anything with it. So we just sat on it. And now he's, graduated from college and whatnot. So if he wants to do something with the Dogecoin, assuming it's worth anything, whatever, good for him. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the extent of my exploration into it. But what I realized, kind of in the intervening years, and studying all of this libertarian movement and the I am stuff and the gold cults and all of that, was that this was an elaborate play to pretty much try to undermine the dollar and the Federal Reserve. And so now I kind of understand it rather differently, and I'm quite opposed to cryptocurrencies on those grounds. Not to say that there isn't some kind of potential, utility and something that works kind of that way, but when the fundamental express intent of the project is to try to undermine, the government and sort of overthrow the country, the government and the country and all of that, like I'm opposed to that. So and the fact that like we've seen so much confluence between the crypto community and like the UFO community, and that Venn diagram, that overlap of crypto and UFO, that's the most anti-government, faction right there. And so it's impossible to miss. I mean, I listened to what is the guy, Paul Hynek, who's Alan Hynek's son,
Right.
give a talk at the Conscious Life Expo, and one of the things that he spent a few minutes talking about was how much he loves crypto. And it's the same anti-government kind of stuff, and there's a especially, as you well know, in Utah and Colorado and Nevada and stuff, there's a big overlap between the UFO world and the crypto world, and they're almost one and the same in some of those contexts. So now I understand it way better. And had I known what I know now in 2013 or something, I probably wouldn't have bothered with it at all. But I am a big believer that if you want to understand something, you need to kind of get your hands dirty with it. And so I understand it well enough to
Right.
know that I'm not interested anymore.
Yeah, and that is really interesting. That is, I mean, it always when I was here at a conference last year, and Avi Loeb was speaking, and Paul Hynek was there as well, and he got up there and spent a majority of his talk, actually, I mean, just
Yeah.
talking about his dad for 5 minutes, and
Right.
oh, here's me as a child blowing a rocket up, and but then
Mm-hmm.
it's all about this is what we're going to do to have currency to connect with the other
Yeah.
intelligence
The
and things,
space
and it was,
currency and
yeah, it
stuff.
was
Yeah.
just like, what? I mean, it's just obvious, a big grift. I mean, it was just so unbelievable to see how many people were being influenced, by that, and people, and a lot of these people probably don't have a lot of money to spend,
Yeah.
and
Well,
so
and what's funny about this is you see there's echoes of this that have happened multiple times over the course of the last 50, 60 years. So there was a thing in the late 90s, early O's called Nasara, which has actually now been folded into the QAnon mythology. But this was the idea of a National Economic Security and Restoration Act, I think it is what it stood for. But there was a guy in Louisiana who came up with this idea for like a new kind of tax law that would, reform the tax system. And, like whatever, it was a reasonable enough proposal and he put it out there. But there was a woman named Shani Candace Goodwin who went by the moniker of Dove of Oneness, who sort of took that Nassara Act and ran with it and started putting out what she called dove drops or something like that. That daily she would like record these messages that would say, this pretty soon the Nassara is going to be revealed and Saint Germain has left you all this money. And of course, again, we get to Saint Germain and money and gold. It's the same myth, really recycled from the I am cult. And so anyway, yeah, the Nassara thing became pretty big, particularly what was interesting was that it was attracting people that had been expelled from the Mormon church. Now think about that for a second as to why that might be,
Hmm.
And so there was a documentary that was made about this, and it's a low budget video type thing, but you can find it on YouTube and it's fascinating. It's called Waiting for Nassara,
Okay.
and it's set in some town in Utah. I forget exactly where. And it's just it's the saddest kind of little ethnographic study because basically what they're doing is they're going to these meetings of this Nassara group that is convinced that Saint Germain has left them money, and they're going to get money, and they follow UFO stuff as well, and it's pathetic in a lot of ways. On the on the one hand, it's pathetic in the sense that you really empathize with these people, and the fact that they're hanging so much hope on the idea that there's going to be like this like debt jubilee thing and they're going to get a bunch of money from Saint Germain, and they've literally got like there was one scene that just it's just quite poignant where they've got like a little poster of Saint Germain with he's a little yellow looking saint guy with like purple violet flame behind him, and then next to that it's like a Diet Pepsi, and like it's the most just America thing ever. So
Wow.
anyway, I recommend folks watch that
Okay.
just to get a sense of like how this has been just done before, and the confluence again of UFO stuff, the gold stuff, and then now the Nassara stuff has been folded directly into the QAnon myth. They call it the That's part of the Great Awakening narrative, and they're calling this stuff QFS, which is pretty much merging Nassara with crypto. And there's supposed to be like quantum phones that people are going to be given to manage their new accounts with all the money from Saint Germain and whatever else. So
That's a good
yeah.
one. Wow. Wow, this is going to get exciting, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, but that's the thing is like they think that this is all happening, and I regret to inform them that it's not. um, but you again have to ask, like, who does that narrative benefit? And I think it benefits Russia and China and the right wingers in the United States that are rooting for them. So we'll see where it
Absolutely.
goes. But
And I think with crypto too, I mean, it's such a it's frightening because of the people that are laundering money, the way that militia groups and neo-Nazi groups hate groups can use that to hide funding
yeah,
and move money around. And I mean, there really are not a lot of positives that I can see that have to do with cryptocurrency.
yeah, no, I mean it's you can make arguments that it's nice to not have to deal with a bank and things go faster, and you don't have to deal with the Federal Reserve and stuff. But there's also a lot of other downsides, like you say. Crime is a big one, although the total number of transactions that are strictly criminal, the people that have done analysis on that have found that it's not that high a number.
Oh,
But
interesting.
most of the other trading is basically a big Ponzi scheme, because pretty much the value of these assets, in all but a few cases, rests on the ability to get money from new people, which is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. So, and the notion that like, you're going to quote invest in this and you're going to get rich because it's gone up in value. Well, that only happens if there's a steady stream of new people, which again is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. So I'm not real sympathetic to the idea that there are too many valid use cases for this stuff. I mean, there's a few interesting sort of ideas that potentially could be, like I'm okay with the idea of like private permissioned blockchains because that's just a way of securely storing data, and that's a long established idea. It's used in all sorts of popular and useful things like GitHub and other stuff. But the idea that there needs to be this permissionless public ledger thing that it just wastes energy. It's just incredibly inefficient. And yeah, there's ways to mitigate that, but it honestly, it's just not worth spending the mental energy on. And that's the consensus that all of the smartest people that I know have reached ultimately, is that it's just, unless you are committed to this weird libertarian agenda, it's just not worth the trouble.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. It's a really interesting, obviously, as we've mentioned multiple times, it's just such an interesting and really alarming period of time in our history. And it'll be interesting to see, especially over the next couple of years, how things are going to play out. And I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts? Where are you looking now? What are you really digging your heels into?
Yeah, so I'm, kind of looking at a few different areas. One is I'm keeping a very close eye on this financial situation. The debt ceiling standoff that's emerging needs to be resolved in a way that's responsible. If for whatever reason the United States defaults on its debt, it'll be a really bad deal for the dollar, and for U.S. power globally. And unfortunately, there's a lot of Americans, people like Balaji Srinivasan and Peter Thiel and others, who are rooting for us to default. And that's terrifying. I think that threat is underappreciated by the government, and I think they maybe don't fully understand the history that's motivating some of this. So my hope is somebody there knows what's going on and has a plan, but so far I haven't seen it, so I'm a little nervous. But that I'm also working on a kind of a book project that's probably going to be a little bit of a long-term effort, because it just takes so much time to try to put all this stuff together. But basically what I want to do is outline some of the history of kind of how we got here, some of the ideas, that some of the things around social influence, all of this stuff around the history of the gold standard and how it's sort of affected the political imagination globally. And so I'm doing a lot of research on that kind of on an ongoing basis. And what's crazy about it is, like, we just keep finding, it's like the worst onion in the world, because we just keep finding all of these layers upon layers of crazy people and stories. And so I've been doing a lot of FOIA requests to the government to try to get, different information on people. Because again, there's only so much you can kind of do just by like Googling around and, speculating online. At some point you really need to go do primary source research. And my training is in the field of history, is such that, like, yeah, I know how to do all that. So digging into records and talking to people, getting firsthand interviews with people who were there, as opposed to just speculating, that's super helpful, but it takes a lot of time.
Right.
So like as I mentioned, I've been researching that sort of alternative health movement from the right got mixed in with the New Age movement, and I want to write more about that.
That'd be so
Um,
cool.
yeah, so I think, what I am, just every time I figure something like out for myself, there's like this huge aha moment of like, oh, I see how this happened. But you got to get to that point where you have enough information to make that connect. I mean, the fact that, like, we found in print that Oprah Winfrey was sending recruiters to the Whole Life Expo in 1994, that's like extremely explanatory.
Yeah.
We don't have to wonder how that happened now. So yeah, just stuff like that. But that kind of archival research takes a lot of time, and fortunately I have a team of folks who are similarly interested in this set of topics, and who are very generously spending their time and sending me information. And we're sort of all helping each other. There's other folks that are involved in this space too, who are trying to produce podcasts and do other research that advances my own work, so I'm trying to help them out. And it's kind of a symbiotic set of research. Just today I was in touch with another researcher and author who is trying to really get a handle on what current, like as in today, Russian disinformation in the US looks like. And so we were working through some data to try to identify specific channels that are probably worth monitoring. But yeah, that's basically the daily life of what I'm doing right now, is just every day wake up in the morning and try to figure out how I can contribute to making things less terrible.
I love that. Well, I think that's all what we need to do. We have an obligation,
Yeah,
to do that as
that's
human
how I feel.
beings,
Yeah.
and yeah, no, I feel the same way. And can you give us a little bit of information on what we could look for with regard to Russian propaganda, disinformation?
Yeah. So, unsurprisingly, there, are several different narratives that, Russia is pushing right now. And, I think it's easy to get hung up on the idea, like, is this source an official Russian disinformation channel or not? I would say don't worry so much about that. Just look at what narratives they're pushing, and if the narratives that they're pushing align with the narratives that Russian official sources are pushing, then effectively they're serving as Russian disinformation for whatever reasons they may have. So the narratives that we tend to see are that the dollar is headed to collapse, that there's going to be a massive, day of reckoning coming, which aligns perfectly with all the libertarian stuff and the PayPal mafia people. There's the narratives around Ukraine being run by Nazis. That's an old chestnut that the Russians have pushed for really ever since World War II, probably before that. And of course, they were delegitimizing Ukraine's sovereignty and whatnot, and everything about Ukraine back in the 1930s during the Holodomor. There's no new real narratives under the sun with Russia. When it comes to Ukraine, it's kind of the same business as usual. They're obviously trying to undermine NATO as much as possible. Of course, NATO is expanding, so that's cool. But yeah, similar kind of stuff coming out of them. The other thing that might be of interest to your listeners and viewers is that there's a whole strain of thought coming out of, or present in Russian propaganda around Russian cosmism, and also the Nazi stuff that they kind of adopted in after the war. So there was a German occult program called Ahnenerbe that was aimed at gathering up occult secrets, and they had the Vril and all of these things that were allegedly involved with like Nazi UFO technology and whatnot. And so the Russians, I don't, I'm not totally clear on how they ended up adopting this. I think it had something to do with the fall of Berlin in 1945, where they kind of felt like that they had captured some of these secrets from the Nazis and they could use them for their advantage. But they basically incorporated some of this Ahnenerbe stuff into like KGB projects. There's a thing that's floating around you can find on the internet called Proect, Proekt Orion, Orion, like normal. And there's an English translation of this document, but basically it alleges to be a KGB document from like the 80s that pretty much is a compendium of Ahnenerbe and Russian cosmist ideas, and all of everything from Hyperborea to Atlantis versus Eurasia and Shambhala and all of this, and we can get into details on that if you want. But
Yeah.
this is stuff that would be familiar to people who have studied, say, theosophy and Russian cosmism. So point being, the Russian cosmos stuff is actually turning up quite a lot in various disinformation narratives. So stuff around the noosphere, which is the idea that the Earth is going to transition into kind of a state of full consciousness, where there's like a brain layer almost to the planet, is prevalent. And what's interesting is that somebody like Elon Musk is actually a believer or a proponent of Russian cosmism. He's talked about uh, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who is the guy who pretty much invented the formulas needed to do rocket flight. And these guys believe weird stuff. They believe that it's necessary for us to go colonize space because there's they want to reanimate the dead, and there's not enough room to reanimate everybody on Earth, so we have to do it in space. So
All right.
that's the belief system there, and you can see how that overlaps with some of the UFO stuff too.
Right.
And there's several different thinkers that are involved in that Russian cosmos tradition. Again, this is something I didn't know a ton about until this year, but there's another guy named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Frenchman, and he had a much bigger influence on the West. But basically, he and Vladimir Vernadsky developed this noosphere concept in the 1920s, and it's hugely popular in Ukraine and Russia, and so everybody there knows about noosphere. Here, less so, and so they've actually developed ideas around creating a government around this noosphere concept, and the idea that it would be kind of ruled by the wise. It's not really supposed to be that kind of elitist system, but in practice, that's how Putin is interpreting it, and he's using the popular enthusiasm for some of these ideas for his own program. And as Putin usually does, is co-opt things that benefit him. So anyway, yeah, fascinating sets of stuff. I mean, I could just talk forever about this stuff because it's just so crazy and there's so much of it.
Well, could you talk a little bit more about it, because it's fascinating me and I don't know that much about it, and I would really love to hear.
Yeah, so I mean, with respect to the Russian cosmism, yeah, so basically this is the relationship that scientists in Russia were sort of scoping out, the relationship between Earth and space. And they were theorizing that space exists. So this would have been late 19th century, and I'm by far from an expert on this, so folks should go do their own research, as they say, and read up on this further. There's a really good book by a woman named Marlena Laruelle, who's a Russia expert, and it's about Russian nationalism, but the whole first chapter is on Russian cosmism.
Okay.
But basically, this became central to the Russian worldview, that it was sort of man's job to go colonize space. And Tsiolkovsky actually said that, the Earth is man's cradle, but you can't stay in the cradle forever. You have to go out into space. And Musk has himself quoted Tsiolkovsky saying that. So there's a direct line between this Russian cosmism stuff and what Musk is doing now. And so they basically believe that it is their job as members of the Orthodox Church to resurrect the dead, and that was and the idea that like death could be banished forever almost, because you would be at some point able to resurrect the dead. And literally, one of the arguments that somebody, the guy who is sort of the proto cosmist, I'm led to believe, is a guy named Fedorov, who was talking about this stuff in the late 1900s. And so the idea being that you would resurrect the dead, and if you did that, you wouldn't have room for them, so you have to colonize space and figure out where to put them. And so that ended up kind of that idea of like the Earth, that you're worried about what you're optimizing for isn't so much the people that are alive today on Earth. It's sort of like you're trying to optimize for everybody who has been alive and everybody who could potentially be alive in the future. You're trying to maximize the number of lives. And so if you're going to do that, you really do need a lot of space, and you need to get to space. So it became a kind of imperative. And so people like Tsiolkovsky kind of took that mandate and was like, well, if we're going to go to space, we got to figure out how to do rockets. And so he developed, the mathematics that were required to make rockets work. And then, Vernadsky was a pretty well-respected geophysicist, chemist kind of guy who was working in Ukraine and in Russia. And he got together in 1922 with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Catholic theologian, and another Frenchman named Edward Leroy. And they kind of theorized that the Earth was going through three phases. So the first phase being the geosphere, which is pretty much like just rock and water and no life, let's just say a lifeless Earth. And then the biosphere, which is the rock plus water plus the layer of life that developed over it. So plants and animals and mammals and us and all of that. And then the third phase was going to be the noosphere, and the noosphere, noos being mind and sphere being planet. That would be this evolution of a consciousness, and that you would end up with what amounted to like a global brain. And that transition point, they called the omega point, where Teilhard de Chardin did, and he pretty much mapped it onto the same kind of level of event that like the return of Christ would have. The idea being there would be this big momentous change that would change everything forever, and that when that happened, it would be potentially violent, because the world would be going from one phase to another, and obviously power would be contested at such a time. And so that transition point, was conceived of by Vernadsky as being a time of great tumult. And so anyway, that philosophy ended up, really informing a lot of what Putin has been doing. He, his chief of staff is a guy named Anton Vaino. And Vaino's claim to fame was that he wrote his PhD thesis, which in Russia isn't so much like doing science as it is like pleasing the right guy, and writing something that gets you a PhD thesis. But he wrote his PhD thesis on a device that he hypothesized or claimed to have developed called a nooscope, where he could actually measure the progress towards this transition into the noosphere. And that's Putin's chief of staff. That's like the number 2 most important guy in Russia. So this stuff is very pervasive in kind of Russian thought, and it also maps very much onto some of the other, I would say, eschatological things that are present right now. So, for instance, the idea of a singularity. That's pretty much the same sort of thing as this omega point transition. Likewise, the transition from, Federal Reserve type central banking into some sort of distributed crypto type thing could be seen as being this kind of a transition point. And where things have gotten particularly dangerous is where all of those eschatological belief systems have now overlapped. So there's an acronym that some folks in this field have developed to describe this called TESCREAL, which is kind of a bundle of belief systems. So it stands for transhumanism, extropianism, which is like the idea that we need to go to other planets, singularitarianism, the idea that a singularity is coming between man and machine, cosmism, C is cosmism, R, what am I missing? R being rationalism. So some of the things like from forums like Less Wrong, talking about how to reason through things, effective altruism, which is what Sam Bankman-Fried was all up into, and then long-termism. And long-termism is a philosophy developed by Nick Bostrom, and basically it's actually kind of a rehash of Russian cosmism in some ways, because what he's arguing is that we need to optimize for the possible lives that might exist in the future. So that includes both human lives as well as artificial intelligences. And he posits that we need to make it possible to colonize space, not only for potentially human life, but also for other intelligent life. And if in the case of artificial intelligence, he posits that there's some planets that might not be appropriate for human habitation, but you could put computers there and run artificial intelligence software on them, and thereby create more life that way. And so he posits a substance called computronium that could be used to build computing infrastructure on otherwise uninhabitable planets. So if that sounds all super crazy and fucked up, I'd say it's because it is. Like, it's really, really bizarre stuff, And so that's what these guys are doing. And I think in the United States in particular, we've kind of I guess, conditioned ourselves to think, oh, well, this is just kind of Republicans versus Democrats, and the Republicans are being very, extreme these days, and isn't it a pity that they've gone and blown up their party and all of that? And like, yeah, that's all true, but there's this other whole crazy thing that's going on at like planet scale that people literally do not understand.
Wow.
So that's kind of where I'm trying to make a difference. Help people see that there's this bigger crazy thing going on.
And absolutely. And thank you for opening my eyes to these things. I didn't know a lot of this that you've talked about. So I appreciate that. And I definitely have more research that I need to do now.
Yeah, enjoy that rabbit hole. It's crazy stuff.
More fun, than Skinwalker Ranch. That'll be much better.
Yeah, well, what I like about working on some of this stuff is that there's actually quite a lot of academic resources, so you can actually be reading real material, not just crazy people on the internet. And once you kind of get into the headspace of like what these people are thinking in the history of where some of these ideas come from, it all makes a little bit more sense. It's still really weird, but it at least makes sense within their frame of reference. And then you can start to predict, well, what might they do if you actually understand where they're coming from.
Yep, that's very important. Well, that's wonderful. I really appreciate that. What do you think? I want to ask you a little bit about before I let you go, but about disinformation in America and things to.
in the remaining few minutes, yeah. I mean, it's a huge problem. I mean, the biggest thing that I think we really need to come to grips with in the United States on that topic is that when the framers of the Constitution put together the First Amendment, I don't think there's much evidence to suggest that they were considering the notion of bad faith speech. So by that, what I mean is that when they were talking about freedom of speech, the idea was that, like, person A thinks this thing and person B thinks this other thing, and they should both have an equal right to air their opinions and to do so in good faith and to share them however they like, and I think pretty much everybody agrees that that's should be defended quite heavily. What I mean when I talk about bad faith speech is when people use speech as a instrument and as a weapon, and they may not mean the things that they say specifically, or they might be intending to achieve a certain kind of an effect by saying a particular thing, and it may or may not be true. It could be true. It could be true and put out in a particular time, so as to create chaos. In the world of information warfare and spycraft, that's what you call an exposure operation. Like if you were to put out true information that for whatever reasons somebody might prefer to keep secret, you might disrupt that person's ability to do whatever they're trying to do, and that might not be reasonable. It might not be fair, and it might give the person that's launching that attack an unfair advantage over somebody else. So I don't know that there has been a lot of discussion about whether bad faith speech should be protected. And what I found really kind of disheartening about like the recent hearing that Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger were doing before the I guess it was the House, but anyway, they were basically arguing that like all speech should be totally protected even if it's in bad faith. And I think that's an interesting threshold for us to be crossing over, because we're really getting to a point where the notion that there might be bad faith speech was sort of implicitly protected by the First Amendment, and everybody was kind of like, well, bad faith speech I suppose happens, but let's just leave it alone. That's the price we pay for a free society. But where we're kind of going now is they kind of want to explicitly enshrine a right to lie, and to say that like that's also protected speech is intentional lying, disruption, all of that. And I'm not suggesting we go pass laws against lying or whatever. I mean, that's a slippery slope, and we want to be cautious of that too. But I think we need to have much more nuanced conversations about what kind of speech we want to protect. And when people are, using their right to free speech and acting in bad faith, they should be called out on it
Right.
in a really forceful way. And I think one of the things that we need to start doing is really tracking networks of people that are perhaps engaged in this longitudinally over time, so as to keep track of kind of like what they're doing, what whether their stories change from year to year, what the target audiences they're going after, and really understand their use of language and information in a detailed, nuanced way. And so far we just haven't been up to that task, because we're still kind of operating in this Pollyanna-ish 20th century mode of like everybody means everything they say. And we just know that's not true. People are paid to say things. People are motivated to say things because of what effects they're going to have. People shift on a dime if it suits them in order to gain political advantage.
Right.
So we just need a much more nuanced kind of understanding of that. And I think also we need to probably move away from the frames of disinformation and misinformation and malinformation and all of that, because it sort of treats it as though it's just a question of the information payload that's a problem, when really what we're talking about, if you put it in full context, is information warfare being conducted by actors who wish to conduct information warfare, which involves their intent. So you can't separate the payload from the intent and the context of why they're doing this stuff, which means we just need much deeper understandings of why they're doing it and all of that. So I think, this is something that we can get better at, but right now we just really lack the skills, mostly because we are still operating in a cognitive frame that's left over from like 1953, and we need to get over that.
I like it. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And you've given me some things that I need to think about and move forward with in a different direction. And I appreciate that. I mean, it's all of this is it's so fascinating, and it is critically important that we understand what the bigger players are doing and their thoughts about things, because it is clearly much more complex and potentially more dangerous than I had even anticipated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a wild world out there, and yeah, the more I understand it, the more kind of terrified I am. But I do take some solace in like actually understanding incrementally better what's going on, because it means that things seem slightly less crazy. It just, it gives you a framework for at least comprehending what's happening.
Where would you suggest that people go if they're trying to educate themselves about some of these things?
That's a good question. I mean, not to be self-serving, but a lot of the stuff that I'm writing for Washington Spectator is very much geared at kind of unearthing this stuff. So I have a monthly column with them called The Wide Angle. I also have done various longer form pieces on, you mentioned the Paranoia on Parade piece, which is about a 12,000 word little mini book on sort of the history of the gold crypto thing from like 1933 to the present, and how that overlaps with January 6th and all of that. As I said, I'm going to be doing a book. But besides that, I mean, I would just say pay attention to, history. Pay attention to good quality history of these topics, and read voraciously. Know the sources. Make sure you're reading good sources. But, there's just so much fascinating depth out there. So, you like, just to pick something off the top of my head, there's a book by a guy named Kevin Coogan called Dreamer of the Day, about Francis Parker Yockey, who was a fascist guy who died in like 1960. But we're still dealing with his legacy, it turns out, because Francis Parker Yockey was the mentor to Willis Carto. Willis Carto was a Holocaust denier who founded something called Noontide Press. Noontide Press was very instrumental in amplifying Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street pretty much shaped a lot of the anti-Fed stuff that's going on. And so it's completely contemporary history, but it's 60 some years old. So there's a lot of stuff like that. There's another really good book about Robert Welch by a guy named Edward Miller. Robert Welch was the guy who founded the John Birch Society. His book is called A Conspiratorial Life, and it's top shelf history. I mean, it's
Okay.
totally, well sourced and annotated, and academically totally sound. So I think one error that sometimes people get into with like studying the space is that they'll kind of dive into reading stuff that's fun to read sometimes, but like highly conspiratorial and not well sourced and
Hmm.
documented. And that's just a mistake, because what you'll end up with is kind of misinforming yourself with stuff that's a little spongy and a little bit soft on rigor and all of that. I would say, where possible, stick strictly to academic history, because there's just so much good stuff to read and watch that's really well sourced and backed up. And then once you've done all that, it's okay to like go indulge in something that's cheese and not well documented, because you want to understand why somebody would write something like that. But you have to it's like the difference between, I don't know, being on stage and backstage. Like, you have to know what's performance and nonsense versus what's actually real. And maintaining a really strong sense of that, I think, is key to operating in this domain, because otherwise, you can really kind of get completely unhinged.
Yes, yes, you can. And
As you know.
yes, as I know, as I've seen, time and time again. I mean, that really truly happens. And I always tell people, if you're interested in studying, this specific topic, look everywhere else to study it.
Yeah,
Go to a
exactly.
library, go hang out with somebody that could teach you about astronomy or teach you about, I mean, and anything else. Just build up your foundation
Yeah.
in a grounded and intelligent way, because you can, it's like you get, oh, here's a book on abduction, and then it's like, oh, straight down that rabbit hole, and
Yeah.
you're not
Yeah.
coming back unless somebody throws you in a lifeboat. But it's very.
Well, yeah, and what I found is that when I'm studying kind of these alternative belief system communities, I put on kind of the hat of being an ethnographer, a sociologist who goes and studies communities and how they operate and what belief systems they have. And you can totally do that. You talk to people, learn what motivates them. You don't have to be mean. You don't have to be, there's no gotcha. You can really, really talk to people and learn what makes them tick. And what I found is that, in general, even people who have belief systems that are very different from my own, as long as you're treating people with respect and honest curiosity about kind of like what you're trying to learn, that they'll be extremely helpful and very nice. And I think that that's kind of the right frame with which to approach this, because ultimately what we're trying to do is understand how this all functions, how the world works. And there's no benefit to being adversarial about that, but you do have to, I think, have clear lines about kind of like who you are, what you're trying to achieve, the reasons why you're participating in certain kinds of things, and make sure that those lines are not blurry.
And that's a very excellent advice. I wish I would have heard that maybe 10 years ago, but I took a little detour, and now I'm.
Hey, we're all on our own journey with this. I mean, I'm just thankful that I've been able to kind of, draw something constructive out of any of this, and hopefully be able to continue to do so.
Yeah, I am as well. And I just knew it was going to be wonderful talking to you. And I would love to have you back on
Yeah,
in the future,
anytime.
because there are many other things that we didn't get to talk about that I would like to. But I do really enjoy watching your work. And I recommend everyone go just look up Dave Troy on YouTube, and you can listen to many of his wonderful talks and his recent interview. And what's the name of the group? That new group with I was talking about at the first of the show. They just started a
Oh,
podcast.
yeah, there's the Radicalized podcast with
Yeah.
Heidi Kuda and Jim Sturtson and stuff. Yeah, they started that a couple years ago, and I
Oh,
think I was their
well, where
first
am I?
guest.
Where have I been?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, but they're doing some good work. So,
Cool. I like that. And that was really great. And then everyone can go to davetroy.com to
mhm.
find your work and keep tabs on you. So is there any other place
Yeah.
they can go?
No, that's the best place. I'll keep links to all my stuff there. So just davetroy.com. And I have about 27 episodes worth of podcasts that go over a lot of this stuff in some detail. I'm overdue on producing some new podcast episodes, but I got so like drawn into this Conscious Life Expo thing, and all the stuff I learned that's attached to that, that I'm trying to put together kind of a sub series on that, and it's proving challenging, but I'm hopeful that I'll have something out on that in the next few days. So stay tuned for that.
Okay, well, I will be looking and I'll post it when I see it. So it's lovely talking to you, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I have to ask you, did you go skiing?
Oh no, I have like rosacea.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You look like me the other day. I was outside. My
Yeah.
skin is so pale, and I just came in and I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, no,
But,
I just have like a kind of I get flushed sometimes, and
oh,
so
I'm
it just ends up.
sorry. Oh, geez.
That's all right. No, it's no worries. It's prominent. Let's say that. So
Well,
anyway, but it was
I was
great
just,
to be here. Thank you so much for having
thank
me,
you
Eric. I
so much. Have
appreciate
a
it.
wonderful weekend, and I will catch you soon. And thank you, everybody, for listening to my show. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. And I will catch you guys next week. Next week, Nick Redfern will be here. And then the following week, on Friday, Dr. Jeffrey K will be here to talk about Guantanamo Bay, which should be very, very interesting. I want to give a shout out to Jack Brewer. Thank you for being a fabulous partner in research. And I hope you have just stay safe. Take care of yourselves. Thanks, Peter, for checking in. And thank you, Mario, for all you do. You guys take care.